welcome. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Or, I might show up at your door. I'm just here to share some creepy stories, so sit back and enjoy. Disclaimer: the content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. It's a quiet town, the kind of place where nothing ever happens, and that's just the way we like it. We don't need the hustle of a big city or the constant hum of activity. Out here, the most exciting thing to happen all year is the annual fishing tournament. Most of the time, you can hear crickets, the wind rustling through the trees, and the distant sound of boats on the lake. But lately, something's been off. My name's Deputy Ryan Blake. I've been with the department for 4 years now. It's not exactly a prestigious job, but it pays the bills, and it lets me live in a place that feels like home. I was born and raised here. The town of Ashford Hollow, nestled between hills and a deep, expansive lake, is all I've known. The lake, or Lake Lucent, as it's called, is what keeps this town running. People come here for the weekend getaways, the peaceful waters, and the fishing. It's a thing of beauty, serene, almost magical. But lately, it hasn't felt so magical anymore. The first warning sign came a few weeks ago. There was a smell coming from the lake, a sharp, metallic odor that made my stomach turn. At first, I thought it was just dead fish, something that happens from time to time. But the smell didn't go away. It lingered, growing more pungent each day. People started talking about it, locals mostly. They'd come into the station, shaking their heads, muttering about the water. They said it wasn't right. Something was off with the lake. I tried to ignore it. Small town gossip, that's all it was. People like to make something out of nothing. But then, strange things started happening. Fishermen began reporting fish floating belly up. I didn't think much of it at first. Overfishing happens. But then, some of them started talking about seeing something else in the water. Something moving beneath the surface. A few described it as a shadow, a massive shape that didn't belong in the lake. The kind of thing you only read about in old folktales. I brushed it off. I had bigger things to worry about, real problems, not the ramblings of old men who spent too much time on the water. But when the first person came into the station with what looked like a rash covering their arms, I started paying attention. The rash was unlike anything I'd seen before, red and blotchy, but it didn't itch. It just spread. They said they'd swum in the lake earlier that day. At first, I thought it was an allergic reaction, maybe from some bacteria or algae bloom. But then, more people came in with similar symptoms. And their stories were all the same. They'd been in the lake. One man, a local carpenter, came in complaining of muscle weakness and dizziness. He could barely stand. His face was pale, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He'd been fishing alone near the deeper end of the lake when it started. At first, he thought he'd just gotten a bit overheated, but then it got worse. His body ached, his eyes felt heavy, and his skin started to change color. He didn't want to talk about it, but his wife insisted he see a doctor. They never made it to the clinic. He collapsed in the parking lot just before entering. That's when I called for backup. I wasn't sure what was going on, but something felt wrong. The sheriff didn't believe me at first, told me to stop stirring up panic. But then it happened again. Another report, this time from a couple of teenagers who'd been swimming in the lake. They said they felt like they were being watched, but when they looked around, no one was there. They described seeing ripples in the water, even though there was no wind. The strangest part? One of the teens was fine when they left, but by the time they got back to their car, her behavior had started to change. She was acting aggressive, refusing to leave the water. When her friends tried to pull her away, she fought them off, like she was someone else entirely. That was the final straw. The sheriff sent out a team to investigate the lake. At first, the response was minimal, some guys in hazmat suits checking the water, looking for any signs of contamination. But they didn't find anything. No chemicals, no unusual bacteria. The tests came back clean, but that didn't explain the sudden changes in people. It wasn't just the sickness. It was the way people started acting different. Not just the ones who'd swum in the lake, but those who had never set foot in the water. Something about this town, about the people, was starting to shift. People who were once friendly, neighbors you'd wave to on the street, now acted like strangers. Tension filled the air. People were more irritable, more paranoid. Little things set them off. Arguments over trivial things escalated into shouting matches. And there were whispers that something wasn't right. People didn't trust each other anymore. The way they looked at you, eyes narrow, skin tight around their bones, it wasn't the same. The local diner, where everyone gathered after work, became a place of silence. Normally, it was full of chatter, of stories from the day, but now the seats were mostly empty, and those who were there sat, staring into their coffee cups. There were fewer smiles, fewer conversations. The owners noticed it too. Fewer customers, and the ones who came in acted like they were always in a hurry to leave. And then the worst part happened. The lake started calling people. It was subtle at first, but it became undeniable. Some folks, ones who'd been affected by whatever was in the water, began returning to the lake like they were being pulled toward it. At night, you could see the lights from their boats out on the water, just drifting, like they were searching for something. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it wasn't good. The whispers of something supernatural, something far beyond simple contamination, started to grow louder. And as much as I wanted to stay calm and chalk it up to nothing, deep down, I knew the water wasn't the only thing that was changing. The people, too, were changing. And I was beginning to wonder if any of us were going to make it out of this town the same as we came in. I wish I could say that things got better after the sheriff ordered the quarantine, but the truth is they didn't. In fact, things got worse. It's strange, really. When the town is shaken, people begin to cling to what they know. They want answers, even if they're just empty words. But the more I tried to ask, the more it seemed like everyone was in a panic. Like they were waiting for something or someone to come to save them. But no one was coming. The sheriff's office wasn't equipped to handle anything like this, and no one from the state or federal level had been willing to step in. I heard whispers that the government didn't want to touch the situation. They were afraid of what they might find. The quarantine zone had been set up around the lake. Any residents who lived too close were moved further out, and a military presence appeared in the town. Just a few armored trucks, a couple of soldiers patrolling, but nothing substantial. They kept saying everything was under control, but we all knew that wasn't true. The first person to really set the town on edge was a local teacher, Mrs. Hanson. She'd been one of the first to complain about the water, but no one thought much of it. Mrs. Hanson had always been a bit eccentric, a woman who liked her conspiracies and weird theories about alien invasions and government cover-ups. It made sense that she'd be the first to jump to conclusions, but when she started behaving, well, differently, I couldn't ignore it. At first, it was subtle. She started showing up late to class, acting confused, almost disoriented, like she hadn't slept in days. But it didn't stop there. She'd leave her students alone in the classroom, talking to herself in hushed tones, saying things like, "They're coming for us," or "They're already here." It was the kind of thing that would make your skin crawl, but we wrote it off as stress or burnout. The real trouble started when Mrs. Hanson was found standing by the lake in the middle of the night, barefoot and staring at the water. The temperature had dropped sharply, but she didn't seem to notice. It was like she was in a trance. And when they tried to approach her, she turned on them. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, flashed a deep, unnatural shade of green. She screamed in a voice that didn't sound like hers, an animalistic shriek that echoed across the water, sending chills through the officers who had to drag her away. She was locked in a holding cell at the station, but we didn't know what to do with her. She didn't speak much after that night, but her behavior had completely changed. It was like she wasn't there anymore. Not really. She'd sit in the corner of her cell, rocking back and forth, muttering under her breath. She kept saying, "The water's calling us. We must listen." I don't know when it happened, but the next thing I knew, more people were acting the same way. The first case was isolated, but then, one by one, other townspeople started showing the same signs of deterioration. They'd become obsessed with the lake. They'd stare out across the water for hours, sometimes days at a time. They'd stop eating, stop talking, stop living like they used to. And even worse, they started drawing others into their madness. It was like the lake had some kind of pull, something that couldn't be explained. People who'd never had any interest in the water were suddenly drawn to it. It wasn't just physical attraction either, it was psychological. There was a need, a compulsion that seemed to take over their minds. And then came the day when my best friend, Eric, showed up at my door. Eric had always been the guy who kept a level head, the one who kept me sane when I thought things were getting too out of hand. He was a former soldier, tough as nails, and I'd always trusted him. He knew how to deal with things when shit hit the fan. But when he knocked on my door that afternoon, I could barely recognize him. He looked empty. His eyes were hollow, like something was missing behind them. His skin was pale, and his lips were cracked as though he hadn't had a drink in days. But it was his words that sent a cold shiver down my spine. "They're waiting," he said, his voice low and strained. "It's all connected to the water. You've got to listen to it. You'll see. You have to see what I see." I tried to get him to sit down, to talk, to explain what he was saying, but he wouldn't stop. He couldn't stop. It was like his mind was slipping away, slipping into something I couldn't follow. "Eric, you need to snap out of it," I said, grabbing him by the shoulders. "The water's messing with your head. It's changing people. You hear me?" He just shook his head slowly, as if he hadn't heard me. His eyes darted toward the lake, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something, recognition, maybe. Then his face twisted, almost in agony. "They're calling me," he whispered. "I have to go." Before I could stop him, he turned and ran toward the edge of town, heading straight for the water. I chased after him, but by the time I reached the lake, he was already on a boat, drifting out into the middle, his head tilted back as though he were listening to something only he could hear. The boat rocked gently, its engine silent, and there was a moment when I thought maybe, just maybe, I could convince him to turn back, but I couldn't. I could see it in his face. Something had taken hold of him, something I couldn't understand. It wasn't until the next morning that I found out what happened to Eric. His boat was found drifting, but there was no sign of him. The lake was calm, as if nothing had happened at all. But when the police pulled the boat back to shore, it was covered in strange, black marks, like something had been clawing at the sides. And there, in the boat, was a single shredded piece of cloth, stained with a dark, viscous substance. It was the first real sign that whatever was happening to the people in this town wasn't natural. And that terrified me more than anything I'd ever seen. It's one thing to see your friend lose himself to something you don't understand. It's another thing entirely to watch the world you thought you knew start to unravel. The town of Ashford Hollow, my home, a place I thought I knew inside and out, was becoming a place of nightmares. People who had been the heart of this community, the ones you'd share a drink with on a warm summer evening, were now shadows of their former selves. They were drawn to the water like moths to a flame. The worst part, they weren't just becoming obsessed with it. They were changing in ways I couldn't explain. The police station was overcrowded. People from all over town were being brought in, either too ill to be left alone or too violent to be trusted outside. At first, it was a handful of people, but soon it became dozens. We couldn't keep up. There was no cure for whatever was happening, no antidote for the sickness that was spreading from the water. The town had effectively shut down. No one was going to work. No one was fishing. The streets were empty. The restaurants, once filled with locals and tourists alike, were abandoned. But the strangest thing was how the water kept calling to us. It was like it was alive, like it was waiting for something. I couldn't go near it. The very thought of stepping foot near the lake now filled me with a sense of dread, like I could feel the water's pull trying to drag me under. I wasn't the only one. Most of the survivors, the few of us who hadn't been affected, felt it too. Eric's disappearance was just the beginning. We had no idea where he'd gone or what had happened to him, but I had this feeling that we wouldn't find him, not unless we ventured into the heart of the lake. I couldn't shake the idea that whatever was changing the people of this town was tied to that water. It was the only thing that made sense. The lake had been here longer than any of us. What if it was controlling the people? What if it was using them? I spent the next few days holed up in my office, trying to make sense of the chaos. I had to focus. People were depending on me. But then, something happened that made me realize just how far we were from any kind of normalcy. One of the infected came involuntarily. At first, I didn't recognize him, but when I saw the name tag on his uniform, my heart sank. It was Officer Jenkins. He was one of the good ones, a man who had been with the department longer than I had. He was the one I'd call when I needed help, the kind of guy who could handle any situation. But when he walked through the door that afternoon, I didn't recognize him. His skin was sickly pale, his eyes glassy, almost lifeless. His uniform looked disheveled, as though he had been wearing it for days. He stood in front of me, staring with those empty eyes, as if waiting for me to acknowledge him. "Blake," he said in a voice that wasn't his own. The words were slow, deliberate, like he had to force them out. I need your help." I tried to keep my composure, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't the Jenkins I knew. This wasn't the officer I'd trained with, worked beside for years. "Jenkins," I said, stepping back slowly. "What the hell happened to you? You look..." His head twitched to the side, and then, with an unnatural jerk, he took a step forward. His eyes fixed on mine, unblinking. "The water's calling me," he said, his voice hoarse now. "You can feel it too, can't you? It's getting stronger. It's changing us." "Stop," I said, shaking my head. "You need to get away from the lake, Jenkins. It's not safe." But he wasn't listening. His hands twitched at his sides, as if he was trying to suppress an urge to do something. His breathing was shallow, ragged. He looked like he was fighting with himself, trying to resist whatever pull was consuming him. I can't fight it anymore," he muttered, barely above a whisper. "They want me to come back. They need me." I grabbed him by the shoulders, trying to get through to him, but it was like he wasn't there anymore. His gaze flickered as if he was staring into another world entirely. "Jenkins," I shouted, shaking him. "Snap out of it. You have to fight this." But then, something happened that made me freeze in place. His mouth opened wide, a guttural growl coming from deep within his chest. It wasn't human. It was a noise I couldn't describe, like something inhuman was clawing its way out of him. And then, before I could react, his eyes rolled back into his head, and his body went rigid. He fell to the floor, convulsing violently. I backed away, heart pounding in my chest, as the sound of his body twitching and jerking filled the room. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was happening to him, but I had no time to figure it out. It was happening again. Something was inside him, inside all of them. The door flew open, and 2 more officers rushed in, having heard the commotion. They froze at the sight of Jenkins, convulsing on the floor, but it wasn't the first time they'd seen this. It was happening all over town. "He's going to the lake," one of them said, his voice trembling. I didn't hesitate. We had to stop him before it was too late. I shouted for backup, and we rushed outside. But when we reached the parking lot, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The streetlights flickered, and a thick fog had rolled in, blotting out the sun. And there, in the distance, I saw them, the others. They were walking toward the water, like zombies, silent and determined. Each of them had the same vacant, feverish expression on their faces. I knew what I had to do. but I had no idea if it was already too late. The streets of Ashford Hollow were eerily quiet as we rushed toward the lake, the fog thickening with every step. It was like the town had been swallowed by an invisible force, and the only thing left was a sense of impending doom. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots on the wet pavement as we hurried forward. The others, those who had succumbed to whatever was happening to the water, were moving in a slow, deliberate march toward the lake. It wasn't just Jenkins anymore. It was everyone. The infected had formed a sort of procession, drawn to the water like moths to a flame. It was a chilling sight, and as we closed the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching the last remnants of humanity slipping away, piece by piece. I turned to the officers with me, trying to keep my voice steady. "We have to stop them. If they make it to the water," but they didn't need me to finish the sentence. We all knew what would happen if they got too close. The question was how we were going to stop them. It wasn't like we could shoot them. These were people we once knew, people we had shared meals with and laughed with. Killing them wasn't the answer, at least not yet. "Blake, we don't know what we're dealing with," Officer Grant said, his voice shaky. "This is bigger than any of us." I nodded, my mind racing. The lake had a pull, something that couldn't be seen or touched, but was there all the same. It was like a magnetic field, drawing people in, making them forget who they were. Jenkins had said it himself. "They want me to come back." Who were they? And what had they done to him? What had they done to all of them? I scanned the horizon, trying to make sense of what was happening. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The lake was still a few miles away, but the procession was getting closer to it by the second. If we didn't act fast, we'd lose them entirely. "We have to find a way to fight this," I said, gritting my teeth. "There's gotta be something we can do." Officer Martinez, a younger officer who had been with the department for only a year, spoke up. "What if the water isn't just pulling them in? What if it's changing them, like it's infecting them from the inside out?" The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. What if the water wasn't just some strange psychological compulsion? What if it was literally altering the biology of the people who drank it or came into contact with it? It would explain why they weren't just acting strange, they were changing. The water was mutating them, turning them into something else entirely. "That's what I'm afraid of," I said, feeling the weight of the realization sink in. "But how do we stop something like that?" "Maybe we don't," Martinez said quietly, his eyes glued to the fog ahead. "Maybe we just survive long enough to find out." We reached the edge of town, where the fog was so dense it felt like a wall. The sounds of the procession had faded, but I knew they were still out there, getting closer to the lake. We couldn't let them get there. I wasn't sure why I felt so certain, but something told me that if they reached the water, if they let whatever was in it take hold, there would be no coming back from it. Not for them, and not for us. I turned to the officers. "We need to split up. Martinez, you take the back road. Cut them off before they reach the lake. Grant, stay with me. We're going straight in." They nodded, and without another word, we moved into position. As we crept through the fog, my heart pounded in my chest. Every step felt like it could be my last. I didn't know what was waiting for us out there, if it was just the infected or something worse. The fog was starting to thin, and I could make out the silhouettes of the people who had been drawn to the lake. They were standing at the water's edge now, unmoving like statues. Their eyes were fixed on the lake, empty and vacant. They didn't even acknowledge our presence as we crept closer. It was like they couldn't see us, or worse, like they didn't care. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as we approached. The air around the lake felt thick with something I couldn't describe. Something wrong. The closer we got, the more oppressive it became. Couldn't breathe. Felt like the world was closing in on me. But we had to get closer. We had to find out what was going on. I motioned for Grant to stay back as I stepped forward, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The others, the infected, stood in a perfect line, all facing the water, their hands at their sides. There was no sign of struggle, no fight. It was like they were waiting for something, like they were in some kind of trance. But then, as I got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The water was moving. It wasn't just the usual ripple of wind across the surface. It was deeper, more sinister. The water was swirling in on itself, creating a spiral right in the middle of the lake. It was like the lake was alive, like it was breathing, pulling itself together into something alive. I stopped dead in my tracks, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? The infected didn't seem to notice. They were still locked in place, their faces expressionless, as if the lake had taken control of their very souls. I couldn't look away from the swirling water, hypnotized by its movement. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the water stopped. It was silent, too silent. I looked around, and that's when I saw it. A figure, no, a shape, emerged from the center of the lake. It was tall, indistinct, and made of something that didn't seem like water at all. It wasn't a person, but it looked like one, moving in a way that was far too fluid, far too unnatural. It rose from the lake, bending and shifting, like it was being formed from the water itself. And the infected, they didn't move. They just watched. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Grant," I whispered, "get back, now." But it was too late. The figure that rose from the water was not human. Couldn't have been. It defied every law of nature I knew. It moved like liquid, twisting and warping, as though it was being formed from the very lake itself. There was no clear shape to it, no distinct features, just a blur of shifting mass that seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. I could feel the air grow colder as it emerged, and the already thick fog seemed to press in tighter around us. Couldn't look away. There was something magnetic about it, something hypnotic that drew my eyes back to the water's surface, even as my instincts screamed at me to turn and run. But there was no running from this thing. Whatever it was, it had a power I couldn't comprehend, and it had the infected, those poor souls who had been drawn to the lake, under its control. It was like they were waiting for it. I felt Grant's hand on my shoulder, shaking me out of my trance-like state. "Blake, we need to go. Now." But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the sight before me. The creature, or whatever it was, slowly began to rise higher, still twisting and warping in ways that made no sense. Its shape became more defined, more humanoid, but it wasn't like any person I had ever seen. Its skin, if you could even call it skin, was translucent, shimmering with a fluid light that made it hard to focus on. There were no eyes, at least not as we would know them, but it seemed to be looking at us, sensing our presence. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This thing knew we were here, could feel us. The infected, who had been standing in perfect formation moments before, suddenly began to move. They didn't walk or run. They glided toward the water, their bodies swaying unnaturally, like they were being guided by invisible strings. They didn't even acknowledge us. Their expressions were vacant, empty. I could see it in their eyes. Whatever was inside them, whatever had taken hold, was completely in control. Grant grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "We have to go. We're not getting out of here if we don't move now." But I couldn't leave. Something was pulling me toward the lake, just like it had pulled the others. My feet felt like they were sinking into the ground, as though the earth itself was reluctant to let me go. I forced myself to take a step back, shaking the feeling off. "We can't leave them," I said, my voice hoarse. "We can't leave them like this. Blake, they're already gone," Grant said, his voice trembling. "We have to focus on getting out of here before it takes us too." But I wasn't listening. My eyes were still locked on the entity in the water. It was watching us, I was sure of it. And it was waiting. "Blake!" Grant shouted, pulling me back harder this time. That's when I heard the sound. It was a low, guttural hum, emanating from the center of the lake. It was almost as if the creature was communicating, sending out some kind of signal that rippled through the air, vibrating in my chest. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up, the sound burrowing deep into my skull. It was calling to us, And the infected, they were responding. I watched in horror as they waded into the water, each of them stepping forward with mechanical precision. They didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. It was like they were being pulled in, drawn into the depths of the lake by something stronger than any of them. "Grant, we can't just let them go," I said, my voice rising in panic. But there was no answer. Grant had stepped back, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Blake," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Look." I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The fog had thickened, but through the haze, I could see something, or rather, someone moving. A figure was approaching from the woods, stumbling through the thick mist toward us. It wasn't one of the infected. This was someone new, someone fresh. "Who is that?" I muttered, squinting to see through the fog. The figure drew closer, and I could make out a few details now. It was a man, covered in dirt and blood, his clothes torn and ragged. But what struck me the most was the way he was walking. It wasn't like a normal person. His steps were jerky, disjointed, like he was being controlled by something beyond his own will. "Hey!" I called, my voice cutting through the silence. "You need to get back. It's not safe." The man didn't respond. He just kept moving forward, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his movements like they were being guided by some invisible force. As he got closer, I could see his eyes wide, panicked, but blank. There was no recognition there, no humanity, just empty, vacant space. "Grant, do you know him?" I asked, turning to my partner. Grant shook his head, his face drawn with worry. "No, never seen him before." "Then what the hell is he doing here?" I muttered. The man's movements became more frantic as he reached the water's edge. His hands twitched, as if he was trying to fight something inside himself. But it was too late. He fell to his knees at the shore, his body convulsing as if he was being overtaken by some force he couldn't control. I watched in horror as he began to crawl toward the water, his hands scraping the mud beneath him, his face twisted in agony. "Please, God, no," I whispered, stepping forward, but Grant held me back. "Blake, you can't help him," Grant said, his voice breaking. "It's too late." But I couldn't just stand there and watch. I had to do something. This wasn't just a sickness or a fever. It was something much darker. It was a force, something ancient and powerful, pulling these people under. And we were next. Before I could react, the man let out a blood-curdling scream, his body arching as if something was tearing him apart from the inside. The creature in the water stirred, and I saw its shape shift, its form becoming more solid, more defined. It was aware of the man's suffering. And then, like some terrible magnet, the man's body was pulled forward, drawn into the lake by an unseen force. He disappeared beneath the surface with a final, silent gasp. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. We couldn't save him, and we couldn't save anyone else if we didn't stop this thing. "We have to leave," Grant said, his voice urgent. "It's over, Blake. There's nothing we can do." But I didn't want to leave. I couldn't leave. Not when the people of this town were being consumed by something so ancient, so powerful. And that's when I heard it. A voice, low and distorted, came from the lake, from the creature. It was speaking to me, or at least I thought it was. "Come to me, Blake." The voice calling my name sent a cold shock through my body. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a force, an invisible hand gripping my mind, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. The creature in the lake. It was speaking to me, or at least that's what it felt like. The air seemed to thicken, vibrating with the sound, and I could feel the ground beneath my feet shifting. "Grant," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to leave now." Grant didn't respond right away, his face pale as he stared at the water. I could see the fear in his eyes, but there was something else too, something I couldn't place. It was like he was listening to something. But what? Was he hearing it too? The man who had been dragged into the water was gone, his body now lost beneath the surface. The others, those who had been drawn to the lake before him, were still there, moving like puppets, each of them staring out at the water as if they were waiting for something. I glanced over at Grant, his hands shaking as he reached for his radio. "I need backup," he muttered almost to himself, but his voice was distant, as though he wasn't really here anymore. Like the pull of the water was starting to drag him in too. "Grant, snap out of it," I shouted, grabbing his shoulder, shaking him. He blinked, as though he was waking from a daze, and looked at me, his eyes sharp and focused once more. "Sorry, you're right. We can't just stand here." But his words were hollow, uncertain. The creature in the water wasn't just some animal. It wasn't even a being in the traditional sense. It was something older, something that had existed long before humans had ever set foot in this town. And it was drawing us in one by one. The people in the water were no longer themselves, their bodies and minds consumed by whatever force had taken root in the lake. They were lost to it, we were lost to it if we didn't act. "We can't save them," Grant said, his voice breaking. "We have to get out. We can't fight this." I shook my head, my fists clenched. "We can't just leave them to die. We need to stop this." But how? How could we stop something like this? The air seemed to hum again, and I felt the voice, the presence in the water, calling to me. "Come to me, Blake. It's time to join us. All you have to do is step forward." It was tempting in a way. The voice wasn't threatening. It didn't demand anything from me. It invited me. It spoke like it was offering a choice to end this madness, to stop the fear, to be a part of something greater than myself, to stop fighting and just let it all go. I couldn't deny the pull. It was like nothing I had ever experienced, this overwhelming urge to step forward and give in. But deep down, something told me that if I did, I would never come back. I would disappear into that water, just like the others. But Grant was still standing next to me, his hand on his sidearm. He was ready to move, ready to leave, and I didn't blame him. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't just walk away. Not yet. "We need to destroy whatever is in that water," I said, more to myself than to Grant. "There has to be a way to break its hold." Grant's gaze was distant, but he was still with me. "Blake, it's not about fighting anymore. Whatever that thing is, it's beyond us. We need to survive, not die trying to fight something we don't understand." I turned to face him, frustration bubbling up inside me. "And what? Let it keep doing this? Let it keep taking people? We can't just let it win." He exhaled sharply, his eyes scanning the lake, his shoulders sagging. "I don't know how to fight it, but I do know we need to get out of here before we end up like them." There was a brief silence between us, the air heavy with unspoken words. I could hear the hum again, faint but persistent, a low vibration that made the ground beneath my feet feel unstable. It was as though the lake itself was alive, constantly shifting, constantly calling. Then something happened, something that made the decision for us. A figure broke through the mist at the far end of the shore. It was another person stumbling toward us. But this one was different. They were covered in mud and grime, their face streaked with blood, their eyes wide and frantic. And they weren't moving toward the water. They were running from it. Grant and I both instinctively moved forward, weapons drawn, though I wasn't sure what good they would do against whatever was controlling the water. The figure collapsed in front of us, gasping for breath, their hands pressed to the ground for support. "Help me," the person rasped, their voice hoarse and desperate. You have to stop it. It's too late. They're coming for all of us." The person's words didn't make sense at first, but then they pointed toward the water, their finger trembling. They'll take you next. They're waiting for you." I knelt beside them, my heart racing. Who's coming?" The figure's eyes flicked toward the lake, their gaze filled with terror. "The others, the ones who were taken. They're not human anymore. They're something else. Something worse." Grant looked over his shoulder, his face pale. "We need to go. This is insane. We can't stay here." But the person was already shaking their head. "No, it's too late. You can't run. You can't hide. You have to stop it before it gets any worse. I stared at them, feeling the weight of their words settle into my chest like a stone. It was too late. The entity had already spread its influence. We couldn't stop it. Not unless we did something radical, something that risked everything. We have to destroy the lake, I said, my voice low. We have to destroy whatever is controlling it. The figure nodded weakly. There's only one way. Burn it. Burn the water. Grant's eyes widened. What? Burn the water? That doesn't even make sense. But the figure didn't answer. They just stared at the lake, their eyes locked in terror. And then, in a whisper that I almost couldn't hear, they said, "It's already too late for all of us." The figure's words echoed in my mind like a curse. It's already too late for all of us. The weight of that statement pressed down on me harder than anything I'd ever felt before. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening here was beyond us, beyond our understanding. It was like we had walked into the middle of a story that had started long before we arrived, and that would go on long after we were gone. I glanced over at Grant, his face pale, eyes wide with panic, and then back at the figure who had collapsed in front of us. They were barely conscious, their breath shallow and labored. "We need to get you out of here," I said, my voice strained. But the figure barely reacted, their eyes still fixed on the lake. The water rippled slightly, as though something was stirring beneath the surface. Something terrible. "The fire," the figure whispered. "It's the only way." They reached out a trembling hand to me. "You have to burn it. Burn the lake. Burn it before it consumes you too." I didn't know what they meant. How could we burn water? It didn't make sense. But that was the thing about this nightmare. It didn't have to make sense. All we knew for sure was that whatever was going on, it was worse than any of us could have imagined. Grant turned to me, his voice tight with frustration. "Blake, we can't just. We don't have a choice," I interrupted, cutting him off. "We need to do something. We need to try. If there's even the slightest chance this works." Grant shook his head, clearly torn. "You really think fire's going to stop this? Whatever it is, it's not human. It's not even anything we know." I didn't have an answer. All I had were fragments of a plan that felt as desperate as it was absurd. We had to try. We couldn't just leave without doing something. Anything. The figure's hand fell limp in mine, and I snapped back to reality. They were unconscious now, or worse, but they had given us a clue. Burn the lake. It made no sense, but there had to be a reason they said it. A reason why fire might be the key. I stood up, eyes scanning the fog-shrouded lake, the pulsing hum of the water vibrating in my chest. Something was coming. The infected were still standing there, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of some unseen force. They weren't moving much now, but I could feel the pull growing stronger. Whatever the entity wanted, it was getting closer to having all of us. "Blake, listen to me," Grant said, his voice shaky. "This is a death trap. If we stay here, we're going to die. We need to get the hell out of here right now." I could hear the panic in his voice, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. The lake wasn't just a body of water. It was alive, and whatever was controlling it was powerful. The voice, the pull, the infected. They weren't random. They were part of a larger plan, a larger scheme that had been unfolding since long before we got here. "We have to try," I said, my voice hardening. "We're not leaving without a fight. Whatever this is, whatever it wants, we can't just walk away. We need to stop it." Grant didn't argue. There was nothing more to say. I could see the fear in his eyes, but also a strange resolve. He knew it too. It was too late for us to turn back. "We'll need supplies," Grant said, glancing around as if searching for something, anything that could help us. "Fire. It needs fuel. We need to make sure we have enough to make it count." "Right," I said, nodding. I saw a supply shed a few hundred yards back. It should have gas cans and anything else we might need. Grant looked at me. "We'll need something else too." "What?" I asked, my pulse quickening. I could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on us. Grant gave me a grim look. Matches, lighters, something to set it off. I nodded again, urgency flooding my veins. I didn't need convincing. I was already moving toward the supply shed. The figure, whoever they were, had given us a chance. A slim one, but a chance all the same. We couldn't waste it. We reached the shed within minutes, the heavy fog making every step feel like an eternity. I could barely make out the shapes of trees around us, everything coated in that eerie mist that had become so suffocating. I was half expecting the infected to emerge from the trees at any moment, but there was only silence. The shed door creaked as we pulled it open. Inside, everything was coated in dust, but the tools we needed were there: gasoline cans, a few extra jugs of fuel, and a couple of lighters. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Grant grabbed the gas cans and started pouring them into the smaller jugs. "This is going to be messy," he muttered, his hands shaking as he worked. "You think this is really going to do anything?" I paused, looking out through the crack in the shed door at the lake. The water was still, as if waiting for us to do something, to give in, to step forward. I couldn't shake the feeling that if we didn't do this now, we wouldn't have another chance. "We don't have time to second guess," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos that was roaring in my head. "We either burn this thing now, or we let it consume everything." Grant didn't respond. He didn't need to. We both knew what we had to do. We filled the jugs and grabbed a handful of rags, stuffing them into the opening. There was no finesse to this. We were making a desperate play, and I wasn't sure it would work. But it was the only chance we had. "Ready?" Grant asked, his face grim. I nodded. "Let's do this." We moved quickly back toward the lake. The mist was thickening again, the silence pressing down on us. I could hear the low hum, faint but growing, coming from the water. It was as though the lake was alive with anticipation, waiting for us to make our move. Grant took one of the jugs and held it out. "On three," I nodded again, clutching my own jug tightly. 1, 2, 3. We tossed the gasoline into the lake, the rags catching fire as they hit the surface. The lake seemed to pulse as the flames spread, a wave of heat rippling out, but the fire didn't seem to spread the way it should. Instead, it felt like it was being absorbed, like the water was drinking it in. "Why isn't it working?" Grant shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. I had no answer. All I knew was that the entity, whatever it was still there, watching, waiting. And then the water roared. The fire that had seemed so hopeful moments ago wasn't behaving as it should. It spread across the surface of the lake in an almost surreal way, creeping along like liquid fire, slow, deliberate. It shouldn't have been possible. Water and fire didn't mix like this, but it wasn't water anymore. I could feel it deep in my gut. Whatever had been in the lake, whatever force controlled it, had warped everything. The laws of nature didn't apply here. "Is it working?" Grant shouted, his voice barely audible over the growing hiss and crackle of the flames. I stared at the water, my heart pounding in my chest. It should have been burning, dissipating, disappearing, but instead, it looked like the water was consuming the flames, absorbing them into its depths. "What the hell is going on?" I muttered to myself, and then it hit me. The thing we were dealing with wasn't just a creature. It wasn't even a living being in the way we understood it. This wasn't about biology or anatomy. It was something else, something far older and darker than anything we could fight. This was a force of nature, a corrupted thing that had found its way into this world, and it didn't care about fire. Cared about control. I turned back to Grant. "This isn't working. It's adapting. It's fighting back." He was looking at the lake with wide, horrified eyes. "Then what the hell do we do now? This is insane. We're just making it worse." I couldn't argue with him. This was far beyond anything I'd expected. The fire wasn't stopping it. It was just making it angrier, more powerful. The ripples in the water began to grow more erratic, sending waves crashing against the shore. The mist thickened, and the hum that had been growing louder now became a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the ground itself. The air was so dense with tension that I could barely breathe. There was no time. The infected people, the ones who had fallen into the lake and had been changed by it, were now stirring. They moved slowly at first, but as the flames flickered across the surface, they began to quicken their pace. The noise from the water was becoming deafening, and I could see the figures on the shore, the ones who had been transformed, their eyes glowing with something unnatural. "Blake!" Grant yelled, snapping me out of my stupor. "We need to get out of here." I shook my head, a wild sense of urgency taking over. "No, we can't just leave. We have to stop this. If we don't stop it." Grant interrupted, his voice strained with fear. "How? This thing isn't human. It's not even real in the way we understand it. It's like we've stumbled into some damn horror story and we're just characters waiting to die." I could see the terror on his face, and it almost made me second-guess everything. Almost. But I couldn't back down now. We couldn't just leave. The fire had already spread too far. The lake, whatever it was, wanted us to stop. It was calling us to give in, to run, but that's exactly what it wanted. It wanted us to be afraid. It thrived on fear. If we let it, it would consume everything. Our town, our families, our lives. I could hear the voices now, faint whispers at first, but growing stronger, more distinct, calling out from the water. "Grant, listen to me," I said, my voice low, firm. "This thing feeds on fear. It feeds on our weakness. We're not just fighting something physical here. It's all mental. We can't let it take us. We can't let it make us afraid." Grant didn't answer. He was looking back at the lake, his hand trembling as he gripped his radio, but there was no signal. The noise from the water had drowned out everything else. The lake itself seemed to be alive, shifting, pulsing with malevolent energy. We had to find a way to end this. But how? The infected figures were closing in now, moving faster, as if the fire had triggered something in them. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes being controlled by strings, but they weren't stopping. The fire had done nothing to them. It was as if the flames couldn't touch them, like they had become part of the lake's curse. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. The whispers were growing louder, more distinct, and now I could make out words in the static. The voice calling my name, beckoning me, urging me to join them. "Blake, come closer. We're waiting. Come to the water." I recoiled, taking a step back. It was the voice of the lake or whatever controlled it. It wasn't just calling me. It was commanding me, pulling at the edges of my mind. But I couldn't give in. Not now. Not ever. I turned to Grant, my resolve hardening. "We need something bigger. We need more fire." Grant looked at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You want to set the whole damn place on fire?" "Yes," I said, voice steady despite the panic gnawing at my insides. "If we can't burn the water, we need to burn the area around it. We need to stop this from spreading. Stop it from reaching anyone else." Grant looked at me like I had lost my mind. "And how do you plan to do that?" "We don't have enough fuel." But I already had a plan. "The gas station. There's a storage tank there. We can set the whole place ablaze if we have to. We can burn it all down, force it back. We have to." Grant hesitated. For a second, I could see the doubt on his face, but then he nodded. He didn't have a choice. Neither of us did. "Let's go," he said, his voice grim. "If this works, we need to get out of here fast. We need to keep moving." I didn't need to be told twice. We turned and started running, our steps quick and urgent. The ground was slick with moisture, the air thick with a sense of foreboding, but I wasn't stopping. Not now. The water continued to churn behind us, but we didn't look back. We couldn't afford to. The run to the gas station felt like an eternity. The fog pressed in on us from all sides, thick as smoke, swirling with that eerie hum that had followed us since the first time we stepped into this nightmare. It wasn't just the oppressive atmosphere that weighed on me, though. It was the relentless feeling that something was behind us, just out of sight, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Grant and I pushed forward, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. I could feel the weight of my own breath, the panic rising in my chest. The farther we ran, the louder the whispers from the lake became. Faint at first, like the breeze carrying an old lullaby, but now unmistakable. The voices were everywhere. They were in my head, calling to me, twisting my thoughts. They wanted me to stop, to turn around, to join them. But I kept moving. We had no choice. "We're almost there," Grant panted, his face set in grim determination. His footsteps were heavy, uneven, and I could see the exhaustion etched into his face. I knew he was scared, but he was doing what needed to be done. For the first time since all of this started, we had a chance to fight back. Ahead, I could just make out the silhouette of the gas station. The building was barely visible through the dense fog, the lights flickering weakly. It was a ghost town, the kind of place that would normally make your skin crawl just because it looked abandoned, but now it felt like the calm before the storm. I had a sinking feeling in my gut that something even worse was waiting for us. "Do you hear that?" Grant asked, his voice tight with suspicion. I paused, straining my ears. The low hum from the lake had intensified, but there was something else now, something heavier. The sound of footsteps, dragging across the ground, slow but deliberate. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. "Keep moving," I whispered, trying to ignore the creeping dread curling up my spine. We reached the gas station, and I quickly scanned the area. There were no infected figures in sight, but that didn't mean we were safe. The place was too quiet, too still. The wind had died down completely, and the air felt suffocating. The world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to make a mistake. "We need to hurry," I muttered, my pulse quickening. I was already moving toward the side of the station, where the large fuel tank was stored. The rusty metal was barely visible in the shadows, but I knew it was there. That's where we'd get the fuel. Grant moved to the opposite side of the building, checking for any signs of movement. He didn't look at me, but I could tell he was already starting to lose his nerve. "Blake, this isn't going to work," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "This thing is too big. You saw what happened with the fire. It didn't stop it. It only made it worse. I don't know what else we can do." I snapped, my frustration matching his. "If we don't stop it now, it will spread and we'll be next. If we can burn the fuel, burn everything around here, we might have a chance to keep it contained. At least long enough to get out." Grant said nothing, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He wasn't wrong. It felt like we were trying to fight a force that was beyond anything we could control. But I couldn't let myself think that way. Not now. If we gave up, everything we'd done so far would be for nothing. I grabbed the nozzle and began to fill up the spare jugs with gasoline. My hands were trembling, my thoughts scattered. Every minute felt like an hour, and the lake was still calling to me, its whispers growing louder. "Blake," Grant said again, his voice strained. "You need to look at this." I looked up to see him standing at the corner of the building, staring out into the fog with wide, terrified eyes. "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't answer right away, just pointed, his finger trembling. My stomach dropped when I saw what he was pointing at. From the shadows, figures were emerging, moving slowly but steadily, as though they had been waiting for us all along. The infected. But these weren't the same as the ones we had seen before. Their movements were jerky, mechanical, as though they were being controlled by something. They moved in a pack, a grotesque horde, but what really made my blood run cold was the fact that they weren't heading for us directly. No, they were circling the station, their eyes fixed on the fuel tank, the gasoline that could burn everything. "They're not after us," I muttered. "They're after the fuel." Grant cursed under his breath. "Why? What does it want with the fuel?" I didn't know, but I wasn't about to let them take it. I grabbed the last of the fuel jugs and bolted for the tank. I could hear the infected closing in, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. The sound was maddening, like a ticking clock counting down to some unseen disaster. "Blake!" Grant shouted from behind me. "We need to go now." I didn't look back. I didn't have time. The infected were getting closer, their rotting forms shambling through the mist, and I knew that if we didn't act fast, they would stop us. The gasoline had to be set. I struck the match and held it over the rag. For a moment, it seemed like time stood still. Then, with a flicker, the rag caught fire and I dropped it into the tank. The flames spread, licking the air as the fuel began to ignite. The fire shot up in a burst of heat and light, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath me. For a second, I thought I was imagining it, but then the lake itself began to react. The water, which had been still, began to churn, rising higher as though the fire was awakening something buried deep beneath. The infected paused, their heads snapping toward the growing blaze. Then they charged. The fire burned hot, an angry, twisting flame that devoured everything in its path. It spread fast, crackling and hissing as it consumed the gasoline. The infected figures charged toward the blaze without hesitation, their movements erratic and unnatural, but they weren't stopping. They didn't flinch at the heat. It was as if they didn't feel it, or worse, that it was part of their grotesque transformation. They were the fire's fuel, and they were closing in on us fast. Couldn't breathe. My head was spinning, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, pounding like a drum. Every step I took felt like I was running on fumes. Grant was just behind me, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. His footsteps were heavy, and his breath came in sharp gasps. "We need to get out of here," Grant shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. I didn't need to be told twice. We were standing at the edge of the fire, surrounded by those things, and the heat was starting to feel like a living thing, pressing in from all sides. But no matter how much I wanted to turn and run, I couldn't. The fire was the only thing we had left to fight back, and it was losing ground. The infected were everywhere now, some of them stumbling, others moving in a sickening synchronized rhythm. They were getting closer to the tank, to the heart of the blaze. I knew it wouldn't be long before they reached it. "There's too many of them," Grant yelled again, his voice strained with desperation. "I know," I rasped, staring at the sea of infected closing in on us. "But we can't let them get the fuel. We can't let them stop the fire." It was a hopeless situation, but I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The water, the lake, had already claimed too many lives. We couldn't let it win. I had to do something. I grabbed Grant by the arm and pulled him toward the building. "Come on. We need cover." We sprinted across the parking lot, our boots slapping against the concrete, the sound drowned out by the growing roar of the fire behind us. We didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. I could hear the infected behind us, their feet pounding the ground with a chilling, rhythmic thud. They were getting closer. "Blake!" Grant screamed as he stumbled, tripping over the uneven ground. "What are we gonna do? The fire's not stopping them. It's spreading too fast." I didn't answer. Couldn't. My mind was racing, running through every possibility, but none of them were good enough. The infected were relentless. They had no fear, no hesitation. They were driven by something primal, something deeper than anything we understood. But even if the fire couldn't stop them, we couldn't just give up. I wasn't going down like this. We reached the back door of the gas station, and I yanked it open. It creaked and groaned as if the building itself was protesting our intrusion. But I didn't care. We needed shelter, even if it was only for a few moments. I shoved Grant inside and slammed the door behind us. The room was dimly lit, a small utility area with shelves stocked with cleaning supplies and tools. There was a small window on the far wall, but it was too high to climb out of. We were trapped. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. The noise outside was deafening now. Screams, hissing, the sound of the infected crashing into the walls of the station. They were getting closer, and we had nowhere to run. My thoughts were scattered, frantic, but I had to focus. There had to be something, anything that could stop this. "Blake, look at this," Grant said, his voice tight with panic. I turned to see him standing near the far wall, his eyes fixed on something. He was staring at a row of old, dusty cans on a shelf. At first, I didn't understand what he was pointing at. But then I saw it. A canister marked with a warning label. Flammable. It was one of the old-style fuel canisters, the kind used for industrial machinery. My heart skipped a beat. We can use this, I said, a surge of hope rushing through me. It's not much, but it's something. We can make one final push. Grant's eyes flicked toward the door as the infected continued to bang against it, their growls muffled by the thick walls. But how? How are we going to set it off? We don't need to set it off, I said, my voice low, steady. We just need to make sure they can't reach the fire. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was all I had. I grabbed the canister and pulled the safety pin, ignoring the strange sense of dread creeping up my spine. The moment I did, a terrible screeching noise came from the door. The infected were trying to break in. They were close, too close. The fire behind us was pushing them forward, and the walls of the station were starting to tremble. I didn't hesitate. I pulled the canister across the floor, towards the back of the room, where there was a small grate in the floor that led out to the sewer system. It wasn't ideal, but I could make it work. If I could get this to the drainage system, maybe it would buy us enough time. Grant was staring at me, frozen. He didn't understand, but I didn't have time to explain. The infected were nearly at the door. I could hear their raspy breathing, their dragging feet, and the sound of their fists pounding on the walls. They would be through soon. I threw the canister toward the grate and used my boot to force it into the small opening. The noise outside was deafening now, and I could hear the infected breaking through the door. I turned and grabbed Grant by the wrist, pulling him toward the only exit, the window. We didn't have much time. As I shoved Grant through the window, I could hear the infected finally breaking in, their guttural screams filling the air. The blast came a moment later. The entire gas station shook, and the force of the explosion sent us both flying back into the dirt, the shockwave rattling every bone in my body. When I opened my eyes, everything was silent. The fire was gone. The infected were gone. The lake was gone. But was it really over? I turned to Grant, who was staring at the now scorched earth, his eyes wide. His mouth moved, but no words came out. I didn't know what to say either. We'd survived, for now, but there was still no sound. No birds, no wind, just the echo of the blast. I looked up at the sky. It was clear, but something felt wrong. The silence was deafening. I glanced at Grant once more. We're not done yet, I said quietly, the weight of the unknown settling over me. The water had taken so much from us, but it hadn't taken everything.